we're here. We're going to be starting this new little series. This is going to be a D&D workshop, D&D question and answer session, just D&D kind of all in one. Who knows where it's going to go. But this session is going to be talking about character creation. I am here with my good friend, Runic. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Runic. I am a seasoned dungeon master of some years, and
how
yeah,
many how many years?
I first started dungeon mastering the first year of uni. I got into a game with just a few people from uni, and literally after the very first session, the DM didn't want to DM anymore. And so then we as a group decided that we would start rotating DMs for a little bit. We all had characters that we'd rotate in and out as the story needed. And since then, I've been on and off DMing and playing.
So about 6 years now.
About 2015, so yeah, about 6 years.
Wow. Yeah, and I am Ray. I have been DMing for coming up to 2 years, maybe. So yeah, I've been like in the process of like planning and everything for about 2 years, but actually actively running games for probably about a year and a half. So I'm a bit more of a noob to all of the DM stuff, but I am a voracious D&D fan. I watch an unhealthy amount of DM podcasts and live play shows, and I play an unhealthy amount of actual real life D&D. So I have a fair bit of experience as well. And yeah, like I said earlier, this session is going to be talking mostly about character creation. We want to kind of go over our thoughts on what makes a good character, what makes an interesting kind of starting point, and the building blocks that go into character creation, and just talk through our thoughts as DMs of characters that we think have worked well in our campaigns, and also as players talking about what we like to play. So yeah, let's transition
Yeah.
over and get into it. So yeah, characters. Everyone has them. They're great. What's the fuss about? Who needs them?
Anyone needs one who, if you're going to play a TTRPG, even if it's a TTRPG in which you play yourselves, you wouldn't really be playing yourselves, you'd be playing a fictionalized version of yourself.
Absolutely. They are probably the main ingredient that goes into the hot pot that is known as D&D. Every player obviously has their own character that they are going to be in control of, and the DM has many, many characters that they are pulling the strings of and operating like some sick, demented puppet master.
Too many in some cases.
Too many in some cases, for sure. So yeah, where do you begin? A character, it's such a big thing. It's such a daunting thing for some people of trying to create a character that feels right for them. Some people have a really clear vision in their head of what they want, but then find it difficult to translate that onto paper and make it into a real thing. So where do you begin? Do you come from
So
design first or from aesthetic first?
it depends. Usually I'll go for aesthetic either visually or it's not a real word, but tropically. I'll think to
Hmm.
myself, here's a really cool like narrative trope that's always used. What way can I like flip that or change that or like do something really interesting with that to make like a really interesting character? Or I might see like because you know me, I'm always browsing Pinterest, just looking around various art pieces to be like, oh, this is actually really nice. And I might see a piece and I'm like, that looks like someone that I can turn into a character of some sort. But what about you, Ray? How do you come into character creation?
A bit of a mixed bag, I guess. I sometimes I'll find a piece of artwork I really like, but as I like to do a lot of my own character artwork myself, it tends to not be that way around. I tend to not even think about what my character looks like to begin with. I think I like to think of them in terms of like how are they going to play? What's the vibe I'm trying to create for myself, and what's the like play style I'm wanting to invoke? Do I want to be a ruffian street bandit, or do I want to be something a bit more sorcerous or arcane? So I try and find a like type of playstyle that really entices me first, and then I start thinking about what fun unique ways I could twist that playstyle into a character that is going to like be satisfying.
But
um
as someone who was in the game with your first healer, I can tell you, you've always had a knack for creating weird and interesting characters.
I really am drawn in role playing games to characters that subvert expectation. I like playing something where you look at them at first and go, I know what you are. And then you watch them and you go, I have no idea what that is. So I tend to come from it from that perspective. I like to find that unique twist on a class or that unique way of playing something, and then find a character that I think kind of like embodies that unique twist as much as I can.
Honestly, that is a good way to look at it. You're like, this subclass plays very tonally different, like you just listed the Mercy Monk, but also think just things like the Mastermind Rogue, which is a rogue that rather than being like the sneaky, I'm gonna come into your house and stab you in the night, is more of the person that's like, okay, I'm gonna like sit on the sidelines and get other people to do my work for me. I'm not going to be the one in like direct harm's way.
Yeah, for sure. I think they've got a really good catalog now of subclasses that embody that like slightly different twist to what you expect. Some of them are much older, like I think the Eldritch Knight is a good example of that for fighter, where you're kind of bringing some spell casting into a traditionally very melee orientated class. And so yeah, definitely. We can cycle back around to this. I think we were going to talk about some of our favorite characters that we've created and how we kind of like applied this process when we made them. So I think the first two kind of like big things obviously are going to be your race and your class.
So yeah, in fifth edition, you've got your standard fantasy races. So you've got your half orcs, your half elves. Even going as far as some of the new books where you have like the weird and obscure races like Leonin, Triton, centaurs. Even now,
Yeah,
um, so race and class are very important to tonally differentiate your character, their background, their backstory. For example, you're a Triton, then you're going to have probably come from somewhere coastal or somewhere cold. It's not like I was a Triton born in the middle of the desert, but being a Triton born in the middle of the desert might actually be a really fun like way to flip the character on its head. Finding ways to like tie your race and your class into your backstory is usually very important. So you are like a City Watch investigator, you might be going for like Inquisitive Rogue, or you might be going for, a class that is typically more like smart and intelligent and like streetwise. But even then, you're gonna want to like, if you can, find ways to subvert it. So like a wizard being a knight and a paladin being a Sherlock Holmes type might be really fun ways to like throw twists on the characters, providing they make sense.
definitely. Yeah, I think a lot of the time people will take those classes and those kind of design basics from each of those classes. So obviously a fighter, master of martial techniques and combat, and that leads itself very naturally into being a war veteran or being a city guard or being a hired muscle for somebody, some rich noble, for instance. But there's definitely nothing locking you into those. You can always choose to be um, a wizard who went to a magic school but found that they were terrible at learning magic and so decided to just like start hitting people with sticks instead and turned into a fighter. Like there's ways that you can like play with those backstories and find characters that feel very personal and unique. And I think something that's really interesting with what Wizards of the Coast are doing recently is like with Tasha's implementing actual like source book material that lets you change those aspects of your class and race so that you're not locked into the tried and tested idea of what a triton is meant to be, and maybe you want to play something that looks vaguely triton like but is played off your own kind of head canon of what you want it to be rather than what the book tells you it should be, which is great for some races such as like obviously orcs and drow are the ones that they cited as being their main inspirations for it, of wanting to try and break away from potentially damaging stereotypes that those races entailed. But yeah, so I think you touched on it a bit earlier. One of the first things that you should be thinking about is your character's backstory and your contextual story. I would always kind of recommend, I think, working from a kind of backstory outwards approach, just in terms of trying to build a campaign that is going to feel compelling and cohesive and have plenty of hooks that can be used for your own character, but also for your party. Having that strong backstory is going to be really important.
Yeah, a strong backstory is essentially the backbone of a strong character. If you've not got a lot there to support you, people are me gonna start seeing through the cracks of the character, if you know what I mean. Your character's gonna have no motivations to like help the party, and it's just gonna seem a bit flat.
Well, it can lead to an kind of like an imbalance of power in the player party as well, and not in the statistical sense, but just more in the pure relationship dynamic of the party. If a character has come in with tons of backstory development that they've crafted lovingly with the DM's help and kind of like integrated it into the world flawlessly, and then another player has just kind of like waltzed in with a randomly generated character that they've thrown together, one of those characters is more likely than not, unless you've got an incredibly talented off the cuff DM, is going to have a bit more love given to them in the throes of the campaign, where plot hooks, story points, family members, various bits and bobs from that character's backstory are going to manifest and become realized. And the character who doesn't have any of that is going to maybe find themselves feeling like they're not getting the same level of immersion and kind of like integration as the rest of the party in those moments, which could maybe lead to kind of that player not feeling as invested in the campaign as a whole. And for somebody starting out, I think like you don't want to end up in that sort of situation where you're feeling like you're not playing the same game as everyone else because your investment is just not there. So yeah, definitely I think having that
Yeah,
is going to be really helpful.
the main thing you've always got to do when you're making a character is we'll say that a character is a house. Once all the paint is put on and once all the rooms inside are constructed and all the furnishings are put in, you've got to remember that you've got to live in that house now. That character is the person that you will be playing. And if you don't enjoy aspects of it, then you're not going to have a fun time. So you're going to want to fill it up with things you enjoy, uh, things you find fun and interesting, and then bring those things out to show others and be like, hey, you should see my character. It's really cool and fun. And like, here's some of the things they can do.
Definitely, yeah. I think I mean, it's funny that you just went with that house metaphor. I was gonna make some random metaphor to it being kind of like a ship almost, where working out your personality traits, your flaws, your ideals, and your bonds, those are kind of like integral points of a character creation that help kind of like ground your character in a certain way. And I like to think of characters almost as ships that have like laid their anchor, and the anchor represents those kind of like traits and ideals. That's the thing that like holds you in place. But like a real boat, your character drifts on the tide slightly and doesn't stay in one place, but is always held in the general vicinity of where those ideals were rooted. But yeah, you shouldn't feel like, oh, just because I've set this original idea for my character, I can never deviate from that path. I think there's always flexibility in these things.
Well, speaking of character traits we enjoy, why don't we speak of characters we've enjoyed? Either like characters who have been played in games or characters that we've played ourselves.
That's a very cool
Uh,
idea. Do you have
let's
a
ha-
thought to start with, or
well, I was gonna say ladies first, but
oh well, then by all means, go ahead.
wow, okay. I'm gonna say the first real character I played, and I was like, I want to go with something just normal, uh, something easier, if you will, which was just a standard fighter. I ended up going champion fighter in the subclass, who was basically just the big old party tank. Kind of had him be this a bit of a Lothario, if you will. But to him, it was like very pansexual, very open. By the end of the campaign, he, like, for a fighter, bear in mind, not a bard, a fighter, he had slept with a dragon, a hag, several prostitutes of various genders and races, a mermaid, all sorts of creatures and peoples he had relations with. But in the end, he was just looking for a soulmate, and like that was his
Oh,
character arc, was that he'd grown up in like a very loving family. Like him and his siblings all had like a friendly rivalry where their dad was like this big famous adventurer and they were basically all competing to like outdo their dad. And so he was just like looking for someone to go on adventures with. He ended up with the party, went on this big adventure with them, ended up settling down with a prostitute that he'd met, and yeah, they eventually went off and got married together. and it was all very like sweet and wholesome. But he was just as Chad, if you will. But yeah, I think you can have someone who's like the big, strong meathead that's like a bit of a Lothario or a chauvinist, providing they're not like actively like if someone says I'm not comfortable with this and they say that's fine, like the first thing he did was try and hit on one of the other characters, and the other character said I'm not into this, and he was like yeah that's fine, and so that was that. I think that's the thing you got to remember when you're making someone to fit into a party. You've also got to consider everyone else in the party at the same time.
Yeah, I think the importance of a session zero to try and like hone those things out, why having characters created in a vacuum where each player kind of like makes their character themselves and doesn't talk to anyone else about them and then brings them to that first session can probably always lead to disaster in some way, shape, or form, just because there's not been a set of ground rules set and there's not been an opportunity for people to say, actually, I'm not so comfortable with that as a character concept to be in a party with. At the end of the day, this is a game that you are meant to be playing together with your friends, and if you're making people uncomfortable, then it's not really like functioning to the purposes of what a game is intended to do. But yeah, to speak quickly about a character that I enjoyed, in some ways very similar and in some ways very different, I'll talk about Leo a bit. My monk that I played in the campaign that you ran, he was also a bit of a strong boy with not much of a brain, progressively less brain as the campaign went on. Leo was an interesting one for me because I didn't really have too strong of an idea of what I wanted him to be. That he was a Way of the Shadow monk with a few kind of like levels in rogue as well. So he was sort of like a shadowy monk rogue. And he was a really interesting character to play as because, yeah, I didn't have too much backstory planned for him. I had some rough ideas. You and I spoke before the campaign started about some ideas we'd had together, but I purposely left him quite open. I didn't want there to be too much like, I am from here and I'm going on a quest to here. I just kind of left it as he'd escaped from somewhere and was traveling and was looking for a path for his life and was feeling a bit lost. Not charismatic at all, really did in a lot of ways act as a expression of my own insecurities at times as well, where I quite often feel like an uncharismatic idiot and, and would be much happier if I could just punch my way through things if I could. Not very strong in real life, would not survive very long if I tried, but in my head I'd like to sometimes. And yeah, he had an interesting growth as a character where I think he ended in a very different place to where he began, was quick to form attachments with people whom he trusted, and very quick to distrust a lot of people and therefore not form attachments to them. But he had great love for his party. He ended up with a wonderful little hellhound hot dog pet that he loved and cherished dearly. And yeah, he ended up being this like really much healthier expression of a character than I had originally intended him to be. I originally wanted him to be this kind of like, I'm going to be an edgy, chaotic, neutral, don't give a fuck about the world. I'm just going to be this like lone wolf character. And I very quickly kind of like grew accustomed to the rhythm of D&D and realized that kind of character doesn't necessarily always work great in a D&D setting where your party are important and you can't be too much of a lone wolf. So I had to kind of try and find a way to still make him feel like my character that I had originally wanted him to be, but have him change slightly to become more accommodating and become more of a team player. What are things that you've noticed in campaigns you've run where a character maybe didn't work as well? You've
I
DM'd
was about
with
to say
them.
that there is a character that I've played that actually I feel probably didn't work out as well. The campaign was a pirate campaign, so
Mhm.
a lot of people took that to mean let's just be murderers and sail around the sea and commit heinous crimes of evil. Which I'd built a character thinking pirate, so I built a smuggler. She was a Triton warlock and rogue multi-class. We all got to pick like a magic item at the beginning of the game. So I asked if I could like homebrew a bag of holding into like a very small smuggling crate that she like had on her person, and she would like put things in this little smuggling crate. She'd worked with drug runners before, so she wasn't innocent by any means. She was very much of the let's not just murder everyone we encounter type of people. And there was another character in the campaign who'd made something very similar, but we were both chaotic neutral, and everyone else in the party was either neutral or chaotic evil. For example, in the very first session, we were being taken on a ship as prisoners, to basically be executed. We managed to escape. We overran the ship. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of killing doing that. But we eventually found the captain and his like right hand man, and the captain had some very important integral information to my character's backstory, which was the location of the person who'd sold her out. And so I said to them, "Do not kill this man. I need to get the information." What did they do? They killed the man, and I was immediately like, "You
Hmm.
love to see it, don't
You
you?"
love to see it.
If I could go back, we would like make characters with the GM, but we wouldn't
Mm.
make like characters because we were doing it over Roll20. We wouldn't make characters in a call altogether. We made it individually when we had time with the DM. I would say to the GM, "Can we have a call altogether where we say what our characters are going to be like?" Because me and the paladin ended up splitting off from the party, and the DM then had to run two separate games. And
Wow.
again, that I think is pointing out why looking at your party and their personalities, at least some things in common, otherwise they do not work well together. And I think that those two characters who had like very strong character arcs compared to then let's kill and murder and torture. There was a vivid torture scene that still haunts me to this day,
Oh my goodness.
um, that took place in that campaign. So I think that you definitely need to make sure that your characters' personalities work well together.
I definitely want to like get better at talking about limitations. Where do you draw the line? Where do you want your character to kind of like travel and end up? And what do you see your character being? And like what do you not want your character to engage with? Which ties into your like backstory, your trajectory, your like contextual story, and how you tie into the world. And all of these different things are kind of like tied into those questions and can be very demoralizing to a player if you go in with an expectation of, oh, I'm going to be this, and then find a party that is completely antagonistic to that goal, and you feel forced into a different trajectory that you never intended for yourself. And talking a bit about that, like the character trajectory, whether that's something that you plan from the start or whether it's something that is just kind of emergent. Like you were just saying in your story that you were telling, I think there's a mid ground there that you have to try and strike a balance of. You need an idea of where you want your character to end up. You're like, my character is X and I want them to do Y. That is the driving motivation that gets them to step out their front door and go on the adventure. They need something that stops them from just being like, oh, well, I'm a cleric and I just spend my day praying to Pelor about the light and I love it and that's all I want to do for the rest of my life. Maybe you can pull an interesting narrative out of that, but you're like already shutting doors from second zero of your character, which is a difficult thing to work with unless you're very good at improvising and riffing and creating a story from nothing. You're going to have a lot of that with a character that has already like shut doors. Whereas if you're kind of saying, oh, I'm a young hero with a sense of adventure who wants to travel the world and find things, that's like almost tropically generic, but at least it does open the door for many, many opportunities. So yeah, it's a kind of a balance of trying to find something that like gives you momentum, gives you forward, like a forward push, but also like allows you to feel unique and kind of have that inner motivation to kind of like work on your character as well.
Characters can be anything as long as your imagination can imagine it. But I will say that no character is ever going to be free of tropes, if you know what I mean.
For
Like
sure.
you're always gonna find yourself having a trope, and someone might point it out and be like, "Oh, but you're just the bright young hero with the sense of adventure." And honestly, if you can find a way to make that interesting, if only for yourself, like other people don't have to find it interesting, but if you're having fun doing it, then do it. You don't need to make things complicated when making a character. You've just got to make things that you enjoy.
A lot of good humor can come from tropes as well. Like they're not necessarily bad things. I think there's a lot of disdain for the idea of a tropey character or a character that just kind of like is very referential. And it's not inherently a terrible thing. I think we all kind of come into D&D with these preconceived notions of like, I'm going to be the Legolas of the party, or I want to be the Frodo. And we've all watched media or like interacted with things and seen a character where we've gone like, God, I just want to be that character. I just want to like play as that character. And a lot of the allure of D&D is that the game says to you, well, yeah, you can. You can absolutely play as that character if you want to. That's where you can kind of fall into this trap of like a tropey character. Depending on the person, some people are better at this than others, but you can like turn a trope into a strength. You can kind of
Yeah.
like I was talking about right at the start of the session, kind of like trying to find ways to turn a trope on its head and have it subvert people's expectations of what that trope should be. You like turn up and you're maybe like what appears to be a comic relief character in a certain way, but actually you end up having a really poignant and powerful storyline that is heavier hitting because people don't have an expectation of you having those emotional moments. So when they do happen, suddenly it like hits a lot harder.
I've always found that like having weird like features or characteristics is always a fun thing to do. Obviously, in the campaign that you run in St. Chad's, I obviously play Robin, who is
Yeah.
an Eladrin elf. And her weird quirk is that as a very young Eladrin, St. Chad's is obviously a school campaign. It is like everyone is in high school, like high school sixth form. So the quirk that I gave Robin is that Eladrin are known to like change their form. I want to take that and expand it more. And I was like, would it be all right if two of her forms are male, two of her forms are female, and she is basically this very fluid, like interchanging character who basically takes a load of different forms.
Yeah, I mean, you really took like this idea of a character that was already a complex character in the sense of you have this Eladrin trait, which is already an intimidating prospect to maybe some players. But then you were like, let's take it a step further. I'm already like pushing this to begin with by making these forms more different than they should necessarily be, or that the book tells us that they should be, and trying to make them a bit more unique to what I want them to be interpreted as. But then I want to actually take it even a step further than that and make it so that not only do I have these four forms that I swap between, I also have this illusion magic that lets me change form at will to anything else I could possibly want to. And you really just kind of play this chaotic whirlwind of illusions and forms that still manages to shine through as a character, which I think is a feat to achieve when you're playing something that has so many different aspects to it, which is a tricky thing to DM for, but it's fun to DM for at the same time.
So, do we want to move on to our little workshop that we were going to do?
Cool. So what are we going to start with? We're going to roll some dice. Basically, how this is going to work, we're going to roll some random tables and see what the results get churned out as. And we're then going to try and like tie those together and turn those into what we think might be a fairly interesting character to play as, or I mean, or maybe a terrible character to play as. It depends what the RNG gods spit out for us. But yeah, let's get started with that. So first of all, I think we're going to roll for race. Is that right?
Yep, I have the updated reincarnation race table. It's not got all the races on it, but I'm just thinking for the sake of expediency, so I will roll a d100 and see what we get. 75. That is a fire genasi. Ooh, very spicy.
Nice. Cool. Good starting point. So we are playing
Good
as an
start.
elemental, a kind of humanoid elemental that is infused with the element of fire. That already kind of like leads into some interesting thoughts on personality types and backstory, who your parentage might be, where you came from, and your kind of like motivations in life. So that's a very cool starting point.
All right, next should we do class?
Let's go for it.
Yeah, okay. So 12 would be
Wizard,
warlock.
right? Oh, okay.
Now, the thing about warlocks is that you get your subclass at first level. So I will roll a d8 to determine our subclass.
Go
We will
for it.
see what we get. 5. The genie subclass.
Oh my god.
Very good.
Okay, so this is writing itself. Genie, Warlock. Okay, very interesting. So maybe this is the child of a powerful genie who themselves is a genasi.
Or even just
And
like the ancestor of one. Because obviously
oh
genies
yeah.
are like ancient and live for eternity, essentially.
Nice. Okay, so we've got race, we've got class, we've got subclass. Okay, let's do stats first, just to see what that's looking
Let's do
like, and then
statistics.
we can
All right,
work out, and we can play around with those. Maybe we'll just write the numbers down, and we'll see what they slot into
sure.
later.
So the first one, 11, 12, 11, 17, 8, and 11. Ooh, lots of 11s.
Lots of 11s, but that's not terrible. We've got a
No,
17 there, which is nice. Cool. So we've got a good stat in 1, which is probably going to be our charisma stat. Then we've
yeah.
got a 12 and 3 11s and an 8. Not amazing, but we can back that up with the Genasi stats. But yeah, this is definitely going to be a bit of a specialist. Probably more of a caster than anything else, because they're not going to have the strength or dexterity to be doing much damage with weapons. So now we need to think about some backstory and traits for this character, and then finally choose our background for describing where our character came from. But this is a nice little like pausing point to just like start gestating some ideas about what you might want from this. So we've just spoken about how we maybe think that this character would make a good spellcaster, like we were saying about family heirloom. Maybe this is power that has resided in their family for many generations, and they're just one of many ancestors who have learned to tap into this power.
There is actually a very fun background called the inheritor, which is that you are an heir to something of great value, which I think would actually work very well with being someone who has inherited
That would
an
be very
item.
good, yeah.
But yeah, I think if we're thinking for the backstory for this character, we're definitely going to want that they are the descendant of some kind. It can be a parent, a grandparent, anyone
Hmm.
really who is a genie and has this genie relic that has been passed from person to person throughout the family tree, and it has eventually got to this character. Yeah.
Because I think with warlocks, quite often your pact and the person you've made a pact with tends to feel very personal and secret, and it doesn't really become much of a plot point very frequently for the party to deal with. It's more of a like, this is my thing that I've done, usually before your first session even happens, because like we said, warlocks start with their pact already formed.
Do we want to roll now for I'm just going off the inheritor personality traits and stuff.
Let's do it.
So do we
Let's do it.
want? All right. So we will roll a D8 for their personality traits. 5. So the personality trait is I'm confident in my own abilities and do what I can do to instill confidence in others. So very cocksure, very reassuring person. This definitely sounds like someone with leadership potential for the party. I always find that like characters with high charisma tend to take the leadership roles and become like the face, if you know what I mean.
It definitely helps. I mean, naturally in D&D, there's usually a person who ends up being the more vocal person in the group, just by the nature of how humans as people work. So having that person play a character that is more charisma focused, if they're going to be managing a lot of the conversations that end up happening in the campaign, or at least instigating a lot of those conversations, the moment of instigation is usually when a dice roll is going to happen. So having that person start out on a good foot by having a good persuasion or like deception check is going to be a big help to your party. What
Well,
does number 6
ju-
give us?
so the 6 is the ideal. So the ideal of this character, speaking of someone with leadership potential, is nothing and no one can steer me away from my higher calling. Which I'm thinking is definitely
Nice.
like this is the person that's going to be getting the party together to get them out, into the world, get them doing things. Probably that this patron genie is guiding them to do, as is their like higher power that is telling them these things need to happen so that these other things can happen, so that we can achieve some end game. So next we have the bonds.
So this is
Your
what
bonds
ties
are
them to.
yeah, it's really what ties you to the world, ties you to the adventure, basically like grounds you a bit and says like, okay, you like have things that you care about. 5 is I protect those who cannot protect themselves. So very much like a person of the people. This genie might be some sort of benevolent presence that is like, we need to go out and like stop the forces of another like very powerful entity who is causing all these problems. Last but not least, we have And honestly, I always think that this is the most integral part of a character.
For
We
sure.
have the flaw, because a flaw is something that you can very much play up on. So the flaw of this character is the people who knew me when I was young know my shameful secret, so I can never go home again.
Ooh.
Now, this
Hold on.
definitely
Yeah.
throws a curveball in, and what I'm thinking, I don't know if you're thinking what I'm thinking, but it could be that this heirloom was not meant for them. It could be that it was meant for a different family member. Maybe no one knew what the heirloom did anymore. Maybe it stopped doing things and, like, basically become inert. And when this person approached them, it was suddenly like they began hearing whispers in their head. I
That's
don't know if
very
that's what
cool,
you were
yeah.
thinking.
I mean, I was thinking kind of along the lines of maybe there was this magical power, a genie who maybe helped support a small habitat somewhere. There was kind of like maybe they used it as a power source, or his heat in a frigid tundra was maybe the thing that kept the snow away and like helped this like small colony to thrive. This fire genasi, maybe they weren't always a fire genasi. Maybe when they took on the genie's power, they turned into a fire genasi or something like that
Yeah.
through some misfortune or through some secret accident disrupted that power flow, and the genie, maybe they accidentally entered into a pact with him through some obscure historical agreement. Maybe this genie had like one final wish remaining, but nobody knew that except for him. And so they accidentally made this wish and then ended up being bound to this genie forever. And that town or village lost their
Their heat source, yeah.
and had to move. And so this character has kind of been ostracized and had to escape. That's where I was kind of thinking, but definitely I
Yeah,
like what you're
I
alluding
no,
to.
I think that that could work really well.
I think it ties really interestingly into their other traits as well, just looking back at them, and it kind of almost changes what we originally expected them to be into something else. So the idea of protecting those that cannot protect themselves, if this village was somehow lost its veil of protection, maybe this character now feels responsible and like they
Yeah,
need to be the
like
one
guilt.
to guilt is
Mm.
now driving them to protect these people that they have harmed, but they know they can never fully return. So they're having to like travel out into the world to find a new power source to return to their village so that they can like restore that place to the way it should be. And what we would originally have thought of like being a strong sense of like self affirmation and determination of nothing and nobody can pull me away from my higher calling instead now is actually this like feeling of guilt and this feeling of like admonishment where it's like nothing and no one can pull me away from my calling that I myself don't actually want but has been forced upon me because of the power that I've received.
And I was going to say that the personality trait of being confident in these abilities could just be like a false confidence of like I have to be confident in my own abilities because if I'm not, I will fail, and if I fail, everyone dies, like in my
Mm,
village.
nice. I want to play this
And
character. This character's very cool.
and see, and that is how you create a character with a strong backstory. You work these things out, you work these kinks, and you find that little nugget of like, oh, this is spicy, this is good, and you mine that nugget until you find the vein, and then you mine that vein until you find the shaft, and boom, baby, you're rich.
Wow, I'm really looking forward to our Minecraft D&D campaign that you're going to be running ever so soon. But no, yeah, definitely. I think this is taking what really is just random rolls and turning it into what has turned into through a bit of luck on the dice rolls part, but also through a bit of like creative thinking into what could be a really interesting character to actually play in a real campaign. Well,
Yeah,
thank you very much for joining me, Runic. This has been a good first session talking about character creation. We'll be back again fairly soon. We've got the Ravenloft book coming out on the 18th, which I think is
it's a
next
week from
Tuesday, a
today.
week from today. Yeah, absolutely.
We all love Count Strahd.
We really do. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for joining people who are watching the stream. And yeah, we'll catch you guys next time.
See you
Thanks.
later.
See ya. Bye.